The Arizona sun was a hammer, and the world was its anvil. Clara ran, though she did not know from what or to where. Thorns tore at the fine lace of her wedding dress, ripping away the last vestiges of the woman she was supposed to be. The dress was a cruel joke now, a shredded white flag in a war she had not known she was fighting. Her feet, stripped of their delicate shoes, were a bloody ruin. Each step on the scorching earth was a fresh agony, a sharp reminder of her folly. Memory came in splintered shards, the thunder of hooves, the splintering crack of wood as the stagecoach overturned. A man's face, bearded and cruel, his breath smelling of whiskey and rot as he ripped the locket from her neck. The locket had been her mother's. He had laughed. Then there was a gunshot, a scream, and the world had dissolved into dust and panic. She had scrambled from the wreckage, a wild thing propelled by a single, primal command. Run! Now, delirium was a kinder companion than the sun. It painted the shimmering heat with mirages of cool, dark water. It whispered her intended's name, Arthur, a man she had only ever seen in a faded photograph. He was meant to be her salvation, a solid, respectable rancher who would lift her from the poverty that had clung to her like a shroud her entire life. He was safety. He was a future. Now, he was just a name in a ghost story. She stumbled toward a line of green that wavered in the distance, a darker shade against the endless brown and red of the desert. A river. The word was a prayer. Her throat was a knot of fire, her tongue a swollen, useless thing. The green shimmered, danced, and then the hammer of the sun struck one last time, and the world went black. Boone cursed under his breath as he saw it. A heap of white lace and tangled brown hair lying perilously close to the river's edge. From a distance, it looked like a washed-up angel. Some strange, beautiful debris coughed up by the Rio Verde. But Boone had stopped believing in angels a long time ago. He knew what he was looking at was trouble. He moved with the quiet, deliberate pace of a man who lived his life by the rhythms of the wild. His rifle rested easy in the crook of his arm, a natural extension of his body. His eyes, the color of a faded blue sky, missed nothing. The faint tracks of a coyote, the nervous flick of a lizard's tail, and the unnatural stillness of the woman on the sand. Closer, he saw the mess of her. The dress was torn to ribbons, stained with dirt and blood. Her feet were savaged. A nasty gash ran across her forehead, matted with dried blood and sand. He nudged her shoulder with the toe of his worn leather boot. No response. He knelt, his knees cracking a protest, and pressed two calloused fingers against the side of her neck. A pulse, faint and thready. But it was there, a flutter of life as stubborn and foolish as a moth beating against a lantern glass. A sigh escaped him, a sound of profound weariness. He did not want this. His life was a carefully constructed fortress of solitude, built on the bedrock of betrayal and walled with silence. He had his traps, his small, run-down shack, and the vast, empty land that asked nothing of him and offered the same in return. A woman was a complication he could not afford. The last woman he had tried to help had cost him everything. She had taken his heart and used it for target practice, leaving him with a ragged hole that had never quite healed. But he could not just leave her here. The coyotes would come with the dusk, or the sun would finish the job it had started. He was not a cruel man, merely a broken one. With another grunt of resignation, he scooped her into his arms. She was lighter than a sack of feed, all bone and desperation. Her head lolled back, and a soft moan escaped her cracked lips. He ignored it, turning his back on the river and heading toward the ramshackle silhouette of his home. He would get some water into her, bind her wounds, and as soon as she was able, he would point her toward the nearest town and wash his hands of her. It was a simple, solid plan. He clung to it as he carried her across the threshold of his quiet life, the scent of dust and faded lavender rising from her torn dress, a ghost of a world he had long since left behind. The first thing Clara was aware of was the scratch of a coarse wool blanket against her cheek. The second was the dull, throbbing ache in her head and the fire in her feet. She blinked her eyes open, trying to make sense of the dim, unfamiliar space. Rough-hewn wooden walls, a stone fireplace, a single window covered with a stretched piece of oiled hide that cast a mellow, amber light. The air smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and something else, something male and unwashed. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog of her delirium. She sat up too quickly, and the room spun violently. A wave of nausea washed over her. "Easy there," a low voice grumbled from the corner. Her head snapped toward the sound. A man sat on a three-legged stool, a long knife in his hand, meticulously sharpening its blade against a whetstone. He was big, broad in the shoulders, with a dark, untamed beard that hid most of his face. He did not look up, but she felt his gaze on her, heavy and appraising. She was in a strange man's shack, alone. The memories of the robbery, of the leering faces and rough hands, came rushing back. Her heart hammered against her ribs. A frantic, trapped bird. She had to get out, but her body was a leaden weight, and her legs felt like they belonged to someone else. Panic was a luxury. She had learned that long ago in the grimy alleys of her childhood. Fear made you stupid. Fear got you killed. So she pushed it down, deep, and pulled on the only armor she had ever owned, a sharp tongue and a defiant smile. "Well, now," she said, her voice a little shaky but laced with a practiced, teasing lilt. "Did I die and go to heaven? Because I surely must have, to be rescued by such a handsome, silent brute." The man stopped sharpening his knife. He lifted his head slowly, and his eyes met hers. They were startlingly blue, and as cold and empty as a winter sky. There was no flicker of amusement, no hint of a response to her flirtation. He just looked at her, his expression flat and unreadable. "You ain't in heaven," he said, his voice a low rumble, like stones grinding together. "And I ain't your savior." He went back to his knife, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone filling the silence. The dismissal was so complete it almost knocked the breath out of her. Men always reacted. They preened, or they postured, or they got angry. They never just ignored her. It was unnerving. She pulled the rough blanket tighter around her, suddenly aware of her state of undress beneath the tattered remains of her gown. "Then where am I?" she pressed, refusing to let the silence win. "And who are you?" "You're in my home," he said, still not looking at her. "Name's Boone. Found you by the river." "Clara," she offered, then added with a coy smile, "It's a pleasure to make your acquaintance." "Boone?" He grunted, a noncommittal sound that could have meant anything. He finished with his knife, testing the edge with his thumb before sliding it back into the sheath on his belt. He stood, and she had to crane her neck to look up at him. He was taller than she had realized, a mountain of a man who seemed to take up all the air in the small shack. He walked over to the fireplace, picked up a tin cup of water, and brought it to her. He did not offer it gently. He thrust it at her, his movements economical and devoid of any softness. "Drink." She took it, their fingers brushing for a fraction of a second. His skin was rough, calloused, and hot. She drank greedily, the cool water a balm to her parched throat. When she was done, she handed the cup back. "Thank you," she said, her voice softer this time. The act of kindness, however gruff, had momentarily disarmed her. "Don't thank me," he said, turning his back on her. "Soon as you're fit to walk, you're on your way to Prescott." His words were a slap. She was nothing to him, a piece of stray livestock to be patched up and moved along. The fear she had suppressed began to bubble up again, and with it came a hot flash of anger. She had not survived a robbery and a trek through the desert just to be dismissed by some grim, bearded hermit. "And if I do not wish to go to Prescott?" she challenged. He finally turned to face her fully, and for the first time she saw a flicker of emotion in his eyes, irritation. "That ain't my concern. I ain't running a boarding house for lost brides." The mention of her dress sent a fresh wave of shame through her. She looked down at the ruined lace, the symbol of a future that had been stolen before it even began. But shame was a weakness, and she would not show this man any weakness. She lifted her chin, her eyes flashing. "I am not lost," she said, her voice sharp. "I am merely between destinations." A ghost of a smile, so faint it was barely there, touched the corner of his mouth. It did not reach his eyes. "Is that what they're calling it these days?" He moved back to his side of the room, effectively ending the conversation. Clara was left sitting on the cot, trembling with a mixture of fear, anger, and a strange, unwelcome flicker of fascination. Boone was a closed door, a locked box, and for reasons she could not fathom, she found herself wanting, desperately, to find the key. The days that followed were a slow, grinding torment. A freak storm rolled in from the mountains, turning the dry gullies into raging torrents and the dusty trails into impassable rivers of mud. They were trapped. The shack, which had seemed small before, now felt like a cage. The air grew thick with unspoken words and resentments. Boone was a creature of routine. He rose before the sun, tended to his traps, and spent the rest of the day in near total silence, mending his gear or staring out the single window at the relentless rain. He moved around her as if she were a piece of furniture he kept bumping into, an obstacle in his path. He provided for her, but without a shred of warmth. He would leave a plate of food, usually some stringy rabbit stew or hard biscuits, on the small, rickety table without a word. He gave her a clean shirt of his to wear, a huge, homespun thing that smelled of him, and a bucket of water for washing. He expected gratitude. She could tell. He expected her to be meek and thankful, the damsel in distress. Clara would not give him the satisfaction. Pity felt like a cage, and she had been in enough cages to last a lifetime. When he left the food, she would thank him with an exaggerated sweetness that she knew grated on his nerves. When he tossed a bundle of supplies at her feet, a pair of worn boots, a water skin, and a small pouch of dried jerky, she met his stony gaze with a challenging one of her own. "Preparing my dowry?" she asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Preparing you to leave," he corrected her, his voice flat. "I cannot possibly walk in these," she said, holding up the boots. They were twice the size of her own feet. "I would look ridiculous." "Better to look ridiculous than to have your feet cut to ribbons again," he growled, a muscle twitching in his jaw. "Take them or leave them. Makes no difference to me." She snatched them up, her pride stinging. "I will take them, but do not think for a moment that I am indebted to you." He just grunted and turned away, leaving her seething in the silence. The tension between them was a physical thing, a third presence in the room. They bickered over everything. She complained about the drafty walls. He told her to put on another blanket. He criticized the way she folded his shirt. She told him he was lucky she had not used it as a floor rag. They fought over the sleeping arrangements. He had given her the only cot, a narrow bed of ropes and straw, while he slept on a pile of furs by the fire. "It is not proper," she had declared on the second night. "What ain't proper is you dying in the desert," he had shot back. "You got the bed. That's the end of it." She hated him for his gruff charity, and she hated herself for needing it. But beneath the anger, something else was taking root. She watched him when he did not know she was looking. She saw the way his hands, though rough, were surprisingly gentle as he stitched a tear in his leather pouch. She saw the deep lines of sorrow etched around his eyes when he thought he was alone. There was a story there, a deep well of pain that she recognized because she had one of her own. One afternoon, the rain let up for a few hours. Boone came in with a freshly killed rabbit, which he dropped unceremoniously on the table. He pulled out his skinning knife. Clara watched, her stomach turning as he made the first incision. She had seen butchering before, but always from a distance. "You planning on standing there looking useless all day?" he asked without looking up. The challenge was clear. He thought she was soft, a delicate flower who would faint at the sight of blood. The part of her that had worn a lace wedding dress wanted to run outside and be sick. But the part of her that had survived, the part that had run barefoot through the desert, stood its ground. "No," she said, her voice steady. "I plan on helping." He stopped, knife poised, and finally looked at her. Surprise registered in his eyes, followed by a flicker of something else. Skepticism. He gestured with the knife. "Be my guest." She took a deep breath and walked to the table. "Show me what to do," she commanded, not asked. He hesitated for a moment, then began to instruct her in his clipped, practical way. His hands guided hers, showing her how to work the knife, how to pull the skin away from the muscle cleanly. His touch was impersonal, but the warmth of his fingers on hers sent a jolt through her. She tried to ignore it, focusing on the grisly task. It was bloody, messy work, but with each pull of the hide, she felt something inside her toughening. She was not the same woman who had stepped onto that stagecoach. That woman was gone, lost somewhere out in the sun-scorched wilderness. When they were finished, she washed her hands in the basin, her movements stiff. She could still feel the phantom sensation of the rabbit's warm flesh. "You did all right," Boone said from behind her. It was not exactly a compliment, but from him, it felt like a medal of honor. She turned and saw him watching her, his expression unreadable as ever, but she thought she saw a glimmer of something new in his eyes, a reluctant admiration, a grudging respect. It was a small victory, but it was enough. That night, the storm returned with a vengeance. Thunder cracked directly overhead, shaking the little shack to its foundations. Rain lashed against the walls, and the wind howled like a hungry wolf. Clara, who had faced down outlaws and starvation, found herself jumping at every crash of thunder, her heart pounding in her chest. Boone sat by the fire, oiling his rifle, seemingly oblivious to the tempest outside, but she noticed his hands were not quite steady. The storm was getting to him, too. A particularly violent crack of thunder, followed by a flash of lightning that illuminated the room in a stark, ghostly white, made her cry out. She could not help it. The sound was torn from her throat. Boone's head snapped up. He looked at her, huddled on the cot, her arms wrapped around her knees. For a long moment, he said nothing. The only sounds were the roaring wind and the frantic beating of her own heart. She expected a sharp word, a dismissal of her fear. Instead, he stood up and walked over to the cot. He did not speak. He simply sat on the floor, his back against the wall, his rifle across his lap. He was only a few feet away, but his presence was a solid, reassuring weight in the chaotic darkness. They sat like that for a long time as the storm raged around them. The fire cast flickering shadows on the walls, making him look like some ancient, carved sentinel. They did not speak, they did not touch, but in the small, storm-tossed shack, the silence was more intimate than any word, more profound than any touch. It was a shared space, a quiet acknowledgement of their mutual vulnerability in the face of a world that was wild and brutal and utterly indifferent to them both. And for the first time since she had woken up in this strange, harsh place, Clara did not feel entirely alone. The storm broke with the dawn, leaving the world washed clean and smelling of wet dust and sage. The silence it left behind was different from the one before, less heavy with unspoken anger and more like the quiet of a held breath. When Boone stepped outside into the pale morning light, Clara was right behind him. "You have to teach me," she said, her voice firm. He did not turn around, continuing to scan the horizon, reading the story the storm had written on the land. "Teach you what?" "How to shoot that," she said, nodding toward the rifle in his hand. I will not be helpless again. I will not run again. He finally looked at her, his face a mask of stone. No. No. The word was an incredulous echo. Why not? A gun ain't a toy for a skittish woman to be playing with. You'll shoot your own foot off. He turned and started walking toward the line of traps he had set along the river, his stride long and dismissive. Clara's jaw tightened. She watched him go, his broad back a wall of stubborn refusal. She could have screamed. She could have thrown something. Instead, she took a steadying breath, went back inside, and pulled on the ridiculously large boots he had given her. She stuffed the toes with rags to make them fit, tied them tight, and marched out the door after him. He heard her coming, of course. The clumsy sloshing of her steps in the mud was impossible to miss. He did not slow down or acknowledge her presence. He simply kept walking, a silent, grim man on his morning rounds. She followed. She did not speak. She just matched his pace as best she could, her shorter legs working twice as hard. The mud sucked at the heavy boots, and her muscles screamed in protest. But she did not stop. If he was a wall, she would be the wind and the rain, wearing him down one step at a time. For 3 days, this was their new routine. He would set out, and she would follow, a silent, stubborn shadow. She watched him check his traps, her heart aching for the small creatures caught in their iron jaws. But she said nothing. She learned the paths he walked, the way he paused to listen to the wind, the subtle shift in his posture when he sensed something was amiss. He ignored her completely, but she knew he was aware of her every stumbling step. She could feel the force of his irritation radiating off him like heat from a forge. On the 4th morning, he stopped so abruptly she almost ran into him. He spun around, his blue eyes blazing with a cold fire. "What do you want from me, woman?" he growled, his voice dangerously low. "I told you," she said, her own voice quiet but unwavering. "Teach me to shoot." He stared at her for a long, hard moment. He saw the new determination in her eyes, the set of her jaw. He saw the blisters forming on her heels from the ill-fitting boots. He saw a grit he had not expected. A long, weary sigh escaped him. "Fine," he bit out. "But you listen to everything I say. You do everything I tell you. One mistake, one moment of foolishness, and we are done. Understand?" A triumphant smile she could not contain spread across her face. "I understand." The rifle was heavier than she could have imagined. A solid, brutal weight of wood and steel. Boone stood behind her, his presence a suffocating heat at her back. "Hold it firm against your shoulder," he commanded, his voice rough. "Tuck it in tight, or it'll kick you clear to next Sunday. Now, line up your sight with that rock over there, the flat one." His hands came up to adjust her stance, and she flinched at the unexpected contact. His fingers were calloused and strong, his touch impersonal, but it sent a shiver through her all the same. He smelled of pine and gunpowder and the outdoors. He positioned her arms, moved her feet, his body caging hers in a posture of deadly intent. She could feel the warmth of his chest against her back, hear the low rumble of his voice in her ear as he gave his curt instructions. "Breathe out slow," he murmured, his breath stirring the fine hairs on her neck. "And squeeze the trigger. Don't pull it. Squeeze it like you're strangling the life out of it." She took a shaky breath, the smell of him filling her senses. She squinted, lining up the sight, and squeezed. The explosion was deafening, a violent roar that seemed to rip the air in two. The rifle kicked back with the force of a mule, slamming into her shoulder and sending a shock wave of pain through her body. She stumbled back, crying out, and would have fallen if Boone had not been there to catch her. His arms wrapped around her, steadying her, holding her upright. The shot had gone wide, kicking up a puff of dust 10 feet to the left of the rock. "I told you to hold it tight," he grumbled, but his arms remained around her for a second longer than necessary. Day after day, they practiced. The rugged landscape became their classroom. Boone was a harsh, unforgiving teacher. He made her climb rock faces until her fingers bled, track animals until her legs ached, and shoot at targets until her shoulder was a mass of purple and blue bruises. He pushed her, tested her, and never once offered a word of praise. But through the shared hardship, a new language formed between them. They learned each other's stories not through words, but through gestures. She saw the deep, abiding sorrow in his eyes when he looked at the distant mountains, the ones that reminded him of a home he could never return to. He saw the fierce pride in the way she held her head high, even when she was covered in dust and trembling with exhaustion. One evening, as they sat by the fire cleaning the rifles, the silence felt comfortable for the first time. "He was probably on that stagecoach," she said suddenly, her voice soft. Boone did not have to ask who she meant. He just kept working, giving her the space to speak. "Arthur?" she continued, staring into the flames. "My fiancé. He was supposed to meet me in Prescott. I suppose the outlaws killed him along with the driver." She paused, and a strange, hollow laugh escaped her. "The funny thing is, I don't even feel sad. I feel nothing." She looked up, meeting Boone's steady gaze. "Is that a terrible thing to admit? I never loved him. I never even knew him. Not really. He was just a picture and a promise of a house with a real floor, of never going hungry again. He was safety. That's all I wanted." Boone finished with his rifle and set it aside. He picked up a stick and began to poke at the fire, the orange light flickering across the hard plains of his face. "Safety is a hard thing to come by out here," he said, his voice a low rasp. "Ain't nothing wrong with wanting it." "And what about you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What did you want?" He was silent for a long time, the only sound the crackle of the fire. She thought he would not answer, but then he spoke, his eyes still fixed on the flames, as if he were seeing a ghost in them. "I wanted what every fool wants, I suppose," he said. "I thought I'd found it. Once. Her name was Eleanor." He said the name as if it were a shard of glass in his mouth. "She was married to a man who owned half the county back in Missouri. A cruel man. I thought I was saving her." He fell silent again, and Clara held her breath, not daring to interrupt the flow of this painful, reluctant confession. "She told me she loved me," Boone went on, his voice thick with a bitterness that was years old but still sharp. "She made me believe it. She convinced me to challenge her husband. A duel, a gentleman's way of settling things." He let out a harsh, humorless laugh. "I was a Union scout during the war. I knew how to handle a pistol. I shot him, didn't kill him, but I wounded him bad." He finally looked at her, and the pain in his eyes was so raw it made her ache. "It was a setup, the whole thing. She never planned on leaving him. She just wanted him out of her way for a while so she could be with another man, a richer man. She used me. The duel gave her husband grounds for divorce without him losing a penny, and it gave him grounds to have me hunted. I ran, and I ain't stopped running since." The story hung in the air between them, a testament to the kind of betrayal that could sour a man's soul for a lifetime. Clara felt a profound and unexpected kinship with this broken, bitter man. They were two sides of the same coin, both scarred by the illusion of a love that was meant to save them. A few days later, they were tracking a deer deep in the rocky canyons that bordered Boone's land. He stopped suddenly, holding up a hand for her to be quiet. He knelt, examining the ground. "What is it?" she whispered. "Tracks," he said, his voice tight. "Shot horses. 3 of them. And they ain't cowboys." He pointed to a set of prints, a horseshoe with a distinctive nick in one side. A cold dread washed over Clara, so intense it made her feel faint. She had seen that horseshoe before. It had been on the horse of the man who had ripped the locket from her neck, the man with the cruel, bearded face. "It's them," she breathed, her voice shaking. "The men who robbed the stagecoach." Boone's eyes snapped to hers. He saw the sheer terror on her face, the way the color had drained from her cheeks. In that moment, something inside him shifted. This was no longer about a stray woman he had found by the river. This was his fight now. The trouble he had tried so hard to avoid had found him anyway. He stood, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. "Let's go back to the shack." That night, the atmosphere was thick with a new kind of tension. It was not the bickering, resentful tension of before. It was the taut, humming tension of shared danger. Clara could not sit still. She paced the small room, her mind replaying the horror of the robbery over and over. Boone watched her for a while. Then he stood and took his rifle and a blanket and walked to the door. "Where are you going?" she asked, her voice small with fear. "I'm going to build a fire outside," he said. "I'll keep watch. You get some sleep." It was the first time since she had arrived that he would not be sleeping in the shack. The first time he was trusting her to be alone inside. The gesture was so profound, so full of a gruff, unspoken promise of protection, that it brought tears to her eyes. She simply nodded, unable to speak. She lay on the cot, listening to the sounds of him moving around outside, the crackle of the fire he was building. For the first time, he was not a captor, not a reluctant host. He was a guardian, a lone sentinel standing between her and the darkness. And for the first time, in this brutal, unforgiving land, she began to feel safe. But safety was a fragile thing, and her sleep was haunted. She dreamt she was back at the river's edge, dying of thirst. But this time, when Boone found her, he did not pick her up. He just looked down at her with his cold, empty eyes and walked away, leaving her to die. She tried to call out to him, but her voice was gone. She woke with a gasp, her body drenched in a cold sweat. The dream had been so real. The fear of abandonment was a physical pain in her chest. "Don't leave me alone again," she whispered into the darkness, the words torn from the deepest part of her soul. The door creaked open, and Boone's large silhouette filled the frame. He had heard her. He walked over to the cot and knelt beside it. "Just a dream," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "It felt real," she sobbed, unable to stop the tears. He did not know what to do. He was a man of action, of violence and solitude. He did not know how to comfort a weeping woman. He awkwardly reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder. His touch was hesitant, but it was there. "You're safe," he said, the words sounding foreign on his tongue. "I'm here." She turned toward him, and in the dim moonlight filtering through the window, she saw the faint, silvery lines of scars on his chest and arms, visible where his shirt was unbuttoned. Without thinking, driven by a need to connect, to anchor herself to his solid presence, she reached out a trembling hand and traced the long, jagged scar that ran from his collarbone down his chest. It was the mark of the duel. She knew, the physical reminder of his betrayal. He stiffened at her touch, his whole body going rigid. No one had touched him with such tenderness in years. He should have pulled away. He should have told her to stop. But he could not. Her touch was a question, and his stillness was an answer. He let her explore the landscape of his pain, the map of his past written on his skin. She touched another scar on his forearm, a puckered circle where a bullet had gone in. A wound from the war, perhaps. A piece of a story he had not yet told. He looked down at her, at the tears shimmering on her cheeks, at the genuine sorrow in her eyes as her fingers traced his old wounds. And something inside him, something he had thought long dead and buried, cracked open. This woman, with her teasing defiance and her hidden fears, saw him. She saw the broken parts of him and was not afraid. The space between them crackled with an energy that was both terrifying and irresistible. It was a potent cocktail of fear, loneliness, and a desperate, aching need. He leaned in, or maybe she leaned up. He was not sure who moved first. All he knew was that one moment she was tracing his scars, and the next, his lips were on hers. The kiss was not gentle. It was not sweet. It was a collision. It was messy and desperate, and full of all the pain and anger and loneliness they both carried. It was the taste of salt from her tears and the grit of his own unresolved past. It was a drowning man's grasp for a piece of driftwood in a storm. And just as suddenly as it began, it was over. They broke apart, both of them breathing heavily, their eyes wide with shock and confusion. Shame washed over Clara, hot and immediate. What had she done? Boone recoiled as if he had been burned, a dark, shuttered look coming over his face. He stood up abruptly, turning his back on her. "Go to sleep," he said, his voice a harsh rasp. Then he turned and walked out of the shack, leaving her alone in the darkness, her lips still tingling, her heart a wild, chaotic drum against her ribs. The kiss left a chasm between them wider and deeper than any canyon. For 2 days, they moved around it, a silent, awkward dance of avoidance. Boone's words, when they came at all, were clipped and practical, stripped of any possible warmth. Clara's teasing banter was gone, replaced by a brittle quiet that felt like a betrayal of her own nature. The air in the shack was thick with the memory of that desperate, clumsy collision in the dark. The break came in the form of a collapsed fence. A section of the crude corral Boone had built for his pack mule had given way during the storm, the posts rotted and leaning. He set out after his morning meal with an axe and a post-hole digger, his movements stiff with unspoken anger. He did not ask for her help. He did not want it. This was his work, his world, and he wanted to be alone in it. Clara watched him from the doorway for an hour as the sun began its relentless climb. She saw the rigid set of his shoulders, the way he attacked the earth as if it were an enemy. He was building a wall, not just around his land, but around himself, the same wall she had been trying to breach since she arrived. She could stay inside, nursing the shame of that kiss, or she could go out there and help him tear the wall down, one splintered rail at a time. She pulled on the big boots, tied her hair back with a strip of cloth torn from her ruined dress, and marched out into the heat. She did not say a word. She simply walked over to the pile of fallen timbers, picked up one end of a heavy rail, and grunted with the effort of lifting it. Boone stopped, his shovel halfway into the ground. He watched her struggle, her face flushed and beaded with sweat, her arms trembling with the unaccustomed weight. "Go back inside. Clara," he said, his voice flat. "This ain't work for you." "I am tired of being told what is and is not work for me," she said, panting as she dragged the rail toward the new holes he had dug. "You need this fence fixed. I live here, for now. That makes it my concern, too." He watched her for a moment longer, a muscle working in his jaw. He could have argued. He could have ordered her back to the shack, but he saw the same stubborn fire in her eyes that he had seen the day she followed him through the mud. It was a look that did not know how to surrender, with a low grunt that was part resignation, part something else. He turned back to his digging. They worked all day under the brutal Arizona sun. The silence between them was different now. It was not an awkward void, but a space filled with the rhythmic sounds of their labor, the thud of the axe, the scrape of the shovel, the groan of wood, and their own ragged breaths. He did not treat her like a woman. He treated her like a partner. He showed her how to brace the posts, how to use her weight to lift the rails into place. His instructions short and to the point. Clara had never worked so hard in her life. Her hands, which had once been soft, were now raw and blistered. Her muscles screamed with a fiery ache she had never known. Dust clung to her damp skin, turning her into a creature of the earth. But with every post she set, with every rail she hoisted, she felt a powerful, clean satisfaction. She was not a damsel. She was not a burden. She was building something. Late in the afternoon, as they were setting the last post, Boone paused and looked at her. She was leaning against the fence, her chest heaving, her face streaked with dirt and sweat. Her borrowed shirt was soaked through, clinging to the lines of her body. She looked exhausted, broken, and utterly magnificent. He walked over to the water skin hanging from a tree branch, uncorked it, and held it out to her. She took it without a word, their fingers brushing. She drank deeply, the water cool and life-giving. When she was done, she handed it back, her eyes meeting his over the top of the canteen. In his gaze, she saw none of the cold dismissal of the past weeks. She saw something else, something warm and deep. It was respect, hard-earned and freely given. The chasm between them had not vanished, but for the first time, it felt as though they had just finished building a bridge across it. The new fence meant they were running low on supplies. The next morning, Boone loaded the mule and announced they were going to town. The word sent a jolt of both excitement and fear through Clara. A town meant people, civilization. It also meant judgment. She had no proper clothes, only his oversized shirt and a rough pair of trousers he had cut down for her, which she wore belted with a piece of rope. Her hair was a wild, untamed mane. She looked nothing like the mail-order bride she was supposed to have been. "I cannot go looking like this," she said, a note of her old panic creeping into her voice. "You got a choice?" he asked, not unkindly. "It's this or you stay here alone. With those tracks we've found, I ain't leaving you here." He was right. The fear of being alone was greater than the fear of being judged. She nodded, her jaw set. The town of Verde Creek was little more than a single dusty street lined with a dozen wooden buildings, a general store, a blacksmith, a saloon, and a handful of other establishments that catered to the rough needs of miners, cowboys, and ranchers. As they rode in, a hush seemed to fall over the street. Heads turned, conversations paused. Clara felt the weight of their stares like a physical blow. Men on the boardwalk stopped to watch them pass, their eyes lingering on her in a way that made her skin crawl. Women peered from behind curtains, their faces pinched with disapproval. She could hear their whispers, sharp and stinging as horseflies. They saw her ragged clothes, her wild hair, the hard, dangerous man she rode beside, and they drew their own conclusions. She was not a wife or a daughter. She was something else, something fallen. Boone seemed oblivious, his face an unreadable mask as he tied the mule in front of the general store. But Clara could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand stayed close to the pistol on his hip. He was a shield, absorbing their contempt, protecting her with his own formidable presence. Inside the store, the air was thick with the smells of coffee, leather, and dried apples. The storekeeper, a balding man with suspicious eyes, barely grunted a greeting. He tallied up their goods: flour, salt, coffee, ammunition, his gaze flicking from Boone's guns to Clara's worn-out boots. As Boone paid, a woman's voice, loud and laced with cheap perfume, cut through the quiet. "Well, I'll be, if it ain't the little lost dove." Clara turned. Leaning against the counter was a saloon girl, her face heavily painted, her red dress cut scandalously low. Clara recognized her instantly. Sadie, a woman she had known briefly in another town. In another life she had been running from long before the stagecoach, a life of desperate choices and cheap boarding houses. Sadie's eyes, hard and knowing, raked over Clara from head to toe. A malicious smirk played on her painted lips. "Heard a stage got hit," she said, her voice loud enough for everyone in the store to hear. "Heard a mail-order bride went missing. Funny. You don't look much like a bride. Honey, you look just like you did back in Dodge. Scared and hungry." The store went silent. Every eye was on Clara. She felt the blood drain from her face, her carefully constructed composure crumbling. Sadie turned her attention to the storekeeper, her voice dripping with insinuation. "She ain't no real bride. Word is, the outlaws took her with them. She probably ran with them for a few days before this one found her." She gestured toward Boone with a flick of her head. Or maybe she just ran to the next man with a roof over his head. A low growl rumbled in Boone's chest. He took a step toward Sadie, his body coiling like a snake ready to strike. His fists were clenched so tight his knuckles were white. The look in his eyes was pure, silent fury. It promised violence, swift and terrible. The storekeeper backed away, his face pale. Sadie's smirk wavered, a flicker of fear in her eyes. "Boone," Clara said, her voice a sharp whisper. She put a hand on his arm. It was like touching solid rock. "Do not—" He did not look at her. His gaze locked on Sadie. She needs to learn to keep her mouth shut. "Not like this!" Clara pleaded, her grip tightening on his arm. "Please, it will only make it worse. Let us just go." For a long, tense moment, he did not move. The air in the store was so thick with tension it was hard to breathe. Then, slowly, with a visible effort of will, he unclenched his fists. He shot Sadie one last look of pure contempt, then grabbed their sacks of supplies and stormed out of the store without another word. Clara followed him, her head held high, refusing to look at the staring faces, refusing to let them see her shame. But once they were clear of the town, riding back into the vast, indifferent wilderness, the dam of her composure broke. A single tear tracked a clean path through the dust on her cheek. Then another, and another. Soon, silent, racking sobs shook her entire body. Boone did not stop or say anything. He just kept riding until they reached the familiar bend in the river near his shack. He dismounted, tied the animals, and then turned to her. He lifted his arms, and she practically fell off her horse into them. He held her as she cried, his large hands patting her back in a clumsy, unpracticed attempt at comfort. When her sobs finally subsided, she pulled away, wiping her eyes with the back of her dirty hands. She felt hollowed out, stripped bare of all her defenses. "What she said," Clara began, her voice choked. "It was not all lies." Boone simply waited, his face patient, his eyes watching her with an intensity that made her feel as though he could see right into her soul. "I have never been a proper lady," she confessed, the words tumbling out in a rush of shame and misery. "I grew up with nothing. My father drank himself to an early grave, and my mother, she just gave up. I was hungry, Boone, all the time, a kind of hungry that eats you from the inside out." She looked away, unable to meet his gaze, her eyes fixed on the flowing water of the river. "I ran away when I was 16. I did what I had to do to eat. There were times a meal cost more than money." The euphemism was flimsy, but it was the only way she could say it. Arthur, the rancher, he was my chance to be someone else, someone clean, someone respectable. But Sadie was right. I am no real bride. I am just damaged goods. The final words were barely a whisper. She stood there, trembling, waiting for the judgment, the disgust, the pity. She waited for him to turn away. Boone was silent for a long moment. Then he reached out and took her hand. His touch was surprisingly gentle. He did not say a word. Instead, he lifted her hand and placed it flat against his chest, right over his heart. She could feel the steady, powerful beat of it beneath her palm. Thump, 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 thump. A rhythm of survival. "We all got scars. Clara," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur. "Some on the outside." He glanced down at his own scarred chest. "Some on the inside. Don't make us damaged, just makes us alive." She looked up at him, her eyes wide with disbelief and a dawning, wondrous sense of relief. There was no judgment in his face, no pity, only a deep, profound understanding. He was not looking at her past, he was looking at her, and he was not turning away. In that moment, standing by the river where he had found her broken and half dead, she felt a connection to him that was stronger than anything she had ever known. He was scarred, and she was scarred, but here, together, their broken pieces seemed to fit. She raised her other hand and cupped his rough, bearded cheek. He did not pull away. He leaned into her touch, his blue eyes searching hers. The memory of their first kiss, so full of pain and shame, faded away, replaced by this new, fragile intimacy. This time, when he leaned down to kiss her, it was different. It was slow, deliberate, a question asked and answered without words. His lips were soft, hesitant at first, then firmer as she responded. It was a kiss of acceptance, of shared pain, of a desperate, blooming need that had been simmering beneath the surface for weeks. It deepened, becoming more passionate, a slow burn that ignited into a bonfire. She tangled her fingers in his hair, pulling him closer, her body arching against his. He groaned, a low, guttural sound, and his arms wrapped around her, lifting her off her feet, pressing her tight against the solid wall of his chest. When they finally broke apart for air, they were both breathless. He looked down at her, his eyes dark with a desire so raw and powerful it stole her breath. She saw the conflict in his face, the battle between his long-held restraint and the overwhelming need of the present moment. A slow, audacious smile touched her lips. She felt a surge of feminine power, a heady sense of control. She could see the wildness in him, the rough, untamed part of him that he kept so carefully locked away. And she was not afraid of it. She wanted it. She leaned in close, her lips brushing against his ear, and whispered the most dangerous and honest words she had ever spoken. "I'll be good, if you're rough." The words hit him like a physical blow. A tremor went through his body. His eyes squeezed shut, a look of profound anguish on his face. This was what he had been fighting. This was the part of him he had tried to bury after Eleanor, the part that was too intense, too savage for a world of soft words and gentle touches. He had thought that part of him was a curse, and here was this woman, this impossible, infuriating, magnificent woman, asking for it, inviting the storm. He set her down, his hands dropping from her as if she were on fire. He took a step back, shaking his head. "Clara, I cannot—" But she saw the lie in his eyes. She saw the desperate hunger he was trying so hard to deny. She took a step toward him, closing the distance he had tried to create. She laid a hand on his chest again, right over his heart, which was now hammering like a blacksmith's forge. "Yes, you can," she whispered, her voice husky and sure. "I am not made of glass, Boone, and you are not a monster. We are just a man and a woman, here, now, and I need you." That was it, the simple, unvarnished truth of it. I need you. It was the one thing he could not fight, his own need, a great, hollow ache he had carried for years. Rose up to meet hers, with a sound that was half groan, half surrender. He pulled her to him. His mouth crashed down on hers, and this time there was no hesitation, no tenderness. It was pure, desperate, all-consuming passion, a raw and honest claiming. He swept her into his arms and carried her down to the sandy bank of the river, to the very spot where he had found her. He laid her down on the soft earth, the setting sun painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. They tore at each other's clothes with an urgency that bordered on violence, a frantic need to remove every barrier between them. That night, on the riverbank, under a blanket of a million stars, they came together. It was not gentle. It was not polite. It was desperate and real. A collision of two lonely, wounded souls who had finally found a safe harbor in each other's arms. It was a fierce, elemental act of survival, a defiant cry against the wilderness that had tried to break them both. Afterward, as they lay tangled in each other's limbs, their bodies slick with sweat, their breaths slowly returning to normal, he brushed the damp hair from her forehead. "You're brave, Clara," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. She smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached her eyes and made them shine in the moonlight. She traced the line of his jaw with her finger, feeling the rough stubble, the solid strength of him. "And you," she whispered back, her voice full of a fierce and tender possession, "are mine." The world felt different in the morning. Softer, The harsh edges of the landscape seemed to have been smoothed over by the night they had shared. Lying beside Boone on the furs inside the shack, Clara felt a sense of peace so profound it was almost frightening. His arm was draped over her waist, a heavy, possessive weight that felt like an anchor. This, she thought, this is what it feels like to not be alone. When he woke, he did not pull away. He simply looked at her, his blue eyes clear and quiet in the morning light. He traced the line of her cheek with a calloused finger, his touch so gentle it made her want to weep. There were no words. None were needed. Later, after they had eaten, he saddled his horse. "There are outlaw tracks on the North Ridge," he said, his voice back to its usual gruffness, but without the cold edge it had held before. "I need to see how old they are. See which way they are headed. I will be back by nightfall." A knot of anxiety tightened in Clara's stomach. The thought of him leaving, even for a day, left her feeling exposed. The safety she had felt in his arms was a fragile, newborn thing. "Be careful," she said, her voice small. He just nodded, swung himself into the saddle, and rode out, a solitary figure against the vast, empty landscape. Left alone in the quiet shack, Clara felt a restless energy hum through her. The space was Boone's, every rough-hewn plank and dusty corner imbued with his solitary presence. Now, it was theirs. The thought sent a thrill through her. She decided to clean, to impose some small order on the bachelor chaos, to make it feel less like his shelter and more like their home. She started with the small, unsteady table, wiping away weeks of dust. Then she moved to the cluttered shelf above his cot. It held a motley collection of items: a whetstone, a tin of gunpowder, a small stack of worn books. She picked one up. The cover was faded, the title long since rubbed away. As she moved it, a piece of paper, folded and yellowed with age, slipped from between the pages and fluttered to the floor. She knelt and picked it up. It was a letter. The paper was fine, a delicate cream color, a stark contrast to the rough world it now inhabited. The handwriting was elegant, a series of graceful, looping letters that spoke of private schools and a life of leisure. Her own handwriting was a clumsy, childish scrawl. She knew she should not read it. It was his, a piece of the past he had shared with her only in fragments. But her fingers, acting of their own accord, unfolded the brittle paper. "My dearest Boone," it began. The words were a punch to the gut. This was from her, from Eleanor. "I pray this letter finds you, though I know you wish to remain lost to the world. There is not a day that goes by that I do not think of you, of the fierce and noble heart you hide beneath that rugged exterior. You were my untamed champion, my wild hawk in a world of clipped-winged pigeons. What we shared was a love too grand for this petty world to understand. My husband, as you know, is a man of duty, not passion. He provides a cage, gilded though it may be. You, my love, offered the sky." Clara's hands began to tremble. Each flowery, romantic phrase was a dagger twisting in the fresh, tender wound of her own insecurity. She was not a wild hawk. She was a stray cat, scrounging for scraps. He suspects. Of course, he is not a fool. But what can he prove? We were clever, were we not? I know you acted only to protect my honor, to free me from a life of quiet desperation. Your sacrifice will not be forgotten. One day, when the dust settles, perhaps we will find our way back to each other. Until then, know that a part of my soul rides with you on the lonely plains. Remain strong. Remain my untamed love. Forever yours, Eleanor." Clara read it again, then a third time, the elegant words mocking her. Untamed champion. A love too grand. It was all there. The manipulation, the false promises, the poison ivy wrapped in a pretty bow. But all Clara could see was the ghost of a great love, a love for a refined, beautiful woman who understood his noble heart, a woman who could offer him her soul. What had Clara offered him? her body on a riverbank, a desperate, hungry need. She was not his wild hawk. She was his temporary comfort, a warm body to get him through the lonely nights until his real love, his grand love, could return. The fragile peace she had felt that morning shattered into 1,000 pieces. The old, familiar voice of her past whispered in her ear, "You are nothing. You are a convenience. Men take what you offer and then they leave." She carefully folded the letter and put it back in the book, her movements stiff and robotic. She shoved the book back onto the shelf, her hands now tainted by another woman's words. The desire to clean, to make a home, was gone, replaced by a cold, bitter rage. She sat on the edge of the cot, the silence of the shack pressing in on her, and she waited. Boone returned as the sun was bleeding its last colors across the horizon. He looked tired but content. He dismounted, and a small smile touched his lips when he saw her standing in the doorway. It was the first real smile she had ever seen from him. It died the moment he saw her face. "What is it?" he asked, his voice sharp with concern. "What is wrong?" "When were you going to tell me you were still waiting for her?" Clara asked, her voice flat and cold, devoid of all emotion. He frowned, confused. "Waiting for who?" "Eleanor," she spat the name. "Your grand, untamed love. The one whose soul rides with you on the lonely plains." Understanding, followed by a dark, shuddered look, dawned on his face. He looked from her to the shelf above his cot. He did not have to ask how she knew. "You went through my things." The words were not an accusation. They were a statement of fact, layered with a deep, weary disappointment. "I found her letter," Clara said, her voice rising, the cold calm breaking. "I read all about your epic romance, about how you were her champion. Did you feel like my champion last night, Boone? Or was I just a convenient substitute, a warm body to keep her place until she decides to grace you with her presence again?" A muscle in his jaw clenched. He walked past her into the shack, setting his rifle down with a heavy thud. He turned to face her, his eyes as cold and hard as blue ice. "That letter is 10 years old," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "It means nothing." "Nothing?" she cried, a wild, hysterical laugh bubbling up in her throat. "She writes that she will find her way back to you, that you are her untamed love. That does not sound like nothing to me. It sounds like you are a man who is still carrying a torch for a woman who destroyed you." "What I carry is my business," he growled, wounded by her lack of trust. After the intimacy they had shared, after the way he had let her in, this felt like a slap in the face. "I told you she betrayed me. I told you what she did. Did you think I was lying?" "I think you are hiding things," she accused, jabbing a finger at his chest. "You gave me pieces of the story, just enough to make me feel sorry for you. But you did not tell me you loved her like that. You did not tell me you were still tied to her." "I am not tied to her," he roared, his own control snapping. "And I do not have to lay out every damn piece of my past for your inspection. I thought what we had was built on something more than that, something real. Right here, right now. But I see I was wrong. You trust me no more now than you did the day I found you." Outside, the wind began to pick up, a low, mournful howl that seemed to echo the desolation inside the shack. The sky was turning a sickly yellow-brown color. A sandstorm was coming. "How can I trust you?" she screamed, her voice raw with pain and insecurity. "Every man I have ever known has used me and thrown me away. Why should you be any different? You are just better at hiding it behind that silent, wounded act." The accusation hit its mark. He recoiled as if she had struck him. A look of such profound hurt crossed his face that it momentarily silenced her. He had shown her his wounds, and she had just thrown salt in them. He turned his back on her, his entire body rigid with a cold, contained fury. "Get out of my way," he said, his voice a low growl. He began to bar the door and the window, preparing for the storm, his movements economical and violent. The storm hit with the force of a physical blow. The wind shrieked, and sand began to pelt the small shack, finding its way through every crack and crevice. The world outside disappeared into a churning, brown chaos. They were trapped. The small room, which had briefly felt like a sanctuary, was now a suffocating prison filled with their anger and pain. For 2 days, they existed in that prison. The roar of the wind was a constant backdrop to their simmering, hateful silence. They did not speak. They did not look at each other. They moved around one another with a grim precision. 2 hostile planets orbiting in a space that had become too small to contain them both. The air was thick with unspoken accusations, with the bitter dust of the storm and the even more bitter dust of their own pasts. They ate separately, what little they ate at all. At night, he threw a pile of furs in the far corner and slept there, his back to her, a rigid line of rejection. She lay on the cot, listening to the storm rage outside and the even worse storm rage inside her heart. The loneliness was a physical ache, sharper and more painful than any hunger she had ever known. She had pushed him away, and he had let her. She had built a wall, and he had retreated behind his own. On the 3rd night, the storm reached its peak. The wind sounded like a legion of demons trying to tear the shack apart. Every creak and groan of the timbers felt like the end of the world. Clara lay on her cot, trembling, wrapped in a blanket but chilled to the bone. She was terrified of the storm, but she was more terrified of the silence between them. It was the silence of an ending. She could not bear it. She could not. Hating him was exhausting, but being without him was unbearable. She slipped out of the cot, her bare feet silent on the floorboards, which were now gritty with a fine layer of sand. She crept across the dark room to where he lay, a large, still lump in the corner. She knelt beside him. "Boone," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread against the roaring wind. He did not move or give any sign that he had heard. Tears streamed down her face, hot and silent. "I am sorry," she whispered. "I am so scared, and when I get scared, I get mean. I destroy things." Still, he was silent. A sob caught in her throat. She reached out a trembling hand and laid it on his shoulder. "Please," she begged, her voice breaking. "Do not shut me out." She crawled under the furs beside him, curling her body into a tight ball, not touching him but needing to be near his warmth, his solidness. "I need you," she whispered into the darkness. "I need you even when I hate you." For a long moment, he remained perfectly still. She thought he would push her away, tell her to go back to her own bed, but then, slowly, he turned toward her. In the darkness, she could not see his face, but she felt the shift, the slight relaxing of the tension in his body. An arm, heavy and warm, came around her, pulling her against the hard length of his body. She buried her face in his chest, breathing in his scent, a familiar mix of leather, wood smoke, and man. He held her tight, his hand stroking her hair, his other arm a band of steel around her. They did not speak. They just held on to each other, 2 shipwrecked souls clinging to the same piece of wreckage in a raging sea. His hand moved from her hair to her face, his thumb gently wiping away her tears. He tilted her chin up, and his mouth found hers in the darkness. The kiss was not gentle, nor was it punishing. It was something else entirely. It was an aching, desperate confirmation of their shared need. It was full of the bitterness of their fight and the salt of her tears. It was a kiss that acknowledged the pain, the ugliness, and the undeniable, unbreakable bond that existed between them, in spite of it all. They made love with a quiet, aching desperation. It was not the fiery, claiming passion of the riverbank. It was a slow, deliberate act of coming home. It was about finding solace in the flesh, a temporary peace in a world gone mad. It was about chasing away the ghosts, both inside and out. Afterward, they lay tangled together, the storm still howling outside. But its power to frighten her was gone. The real storm had passed. In the exhausted quiet, Boone finally spoke, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "The war, it changes a man," he said, his voice sounding hollow and far away. "You see things, you do things, things you can never take back." Clara held him tighter, listening, knowing that this was a confession he had perhaps never made to anyone. "I was a scout," he went on. "It was my job to go where others could not, to be a ghost. I was good at it, too good. I learned to move without a sound, to kill without a thought. It becomes easy. That's the terrible part. It becomes just a job." He took a shaky breath. "There was a farmhouse. They told us it was a Confederate lookout post. We went in at night, silent. There was a man and his 2 sons, barely old enough to shave. They had rifles. We did what we were ordered to do. It was not until afterward, when it was quiet again, that we found the woman, his wife, hiding in the cellar, the look in her eyes." He trailed off, his body rigid with the memory. "That is the look I see sometimes when I close my eyes, the look of someone whose world has been burned to the ground by men like me." He fell silent, and Clara could feel the tremors running through him. "Eleanor," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "When I met her, it was after all that, I think I wanted her to save me. I wanted her fancy words and her soft hands to wash the blood off mine. I wanted to believe I could be that noble champion she wrote about in her letters. But it was all a lie, and when she betrayed me, it just proved what I already knew deep down." He turned his head to look at her in the darkness. "That I did not deserve peace, that I did not deserve anything good, that the only thing I was fit for was being alone out here with the other ghosts." Clara listened to his raw, painful confession, and her heart ached for him. She saw it all so clearly. He was not a monster. He was a man who had been forged in the crucible of war and betrayal. A man who had been convinced he was unworthy of love. She rose up on one elbow and looked down at him, her hand cupping his cheek. "You are wrong," she said, her voice fierce with conviction. "I do not see a ghost. I see a man who has been hurt. I see a man who has protected me, who has taught me to be strong. I see a man who held me when I cried and who fights for me, even when I am fighting with him. That is the man I see. Boone. And he deserves peace more than anyone I know." He stared up at her, his eyes shimmering in the faint light. He had shown her the ugliest, most broken part of himself, and she had not run. She had held him closer. The storm finally broke just before dawn. The wind died down to a whisper, and a profound, exhausted silence settled over the land. Together, they opened the door and stepped outside. The world was transformed. The landscape was scarred and rearranged, covered in a smooth, rippling layer of sand. The air was clean and sharp. It was a world washed clean, but with the memory of the storm etched upon it, like them, scarred, but still standing. Boone went to a small wooden chest in the corner of the shack, a chest she had never seen him open. He rummaged inside and came back with something small in his palm. He took her hand and turned it over. "I made this a long time ago," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Never had a reason to give it to anyone." He opened his hand. Lying in his calloused palm was a ring. It was carved from a single piece of bone, polished smooth and white as milk. It was simple, unadorned, and yet it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. He slipped it onto her finger. It fit perfectly. "It ain't gold," he said, his eyes holding hers, full of a deep, solemn promise. "But it's real." The bone ring was a circle of quiet permanence on her finger. In the days that followed the storm, it became an anchor for Clara, a smooth, solid reminder that what had passed between them was real. A new rhythm settled over the shack, a peaceful domesticity that was as foreign and wonderful to her as a forgotten dream. They moved together in the small space, a silent, intuitive dance. She would have coffee ready when he came in from his morning rounds. He would mend the sole of her boot without her having to ask. The silence was no longer a weapon or a wall. It was a shared language, a comfortable quiet that spoke of acceptance. But the peace of the shack was an illusion, a tiny island in a vast, dangerous sea. The tracks they had found were a constant, unspoken worry. One morning, Boone rode out farther than usual, his face set in grim lines. He told her he was checking a washout in the North Canyon, but she knew he was hunting for something else. He was hunting for trouble. He returned late in the afternoon, his horse lathered and his face dark as a thunderhead. He dismounted and walked straight to her, his movements stiff with a barely controlled urgency. "They are here," he said, his voice a low, hard rumble. "Camped out in the canyon pass. The same 3 men. I saw the horse with the nicked shoe." A cold dread, sharp and familiar, pierced through the warm blanket of Clara's newfound peace. The ghosts she had been running from had finally caught up. "What will we do?" she asked, her voice a thin whisper. "I will handle it," he said, his emphasis on the word clear and absolute. He strode into the shack and began checking his rifle and pistol, his actions swift and purposeful. "They are holed up, comfortable. They think they are safe. I will wait for nightfall, circle around from the east, and take them by surprise." Clara watched him, her heart beginning to pound a frantic, angry rhythm against her ribs. He was shutting her out, making decisions for her, treating her as if she were a piece of fragile cargo to be protected. "No," she said, her voice stronger now. "We will handle it." He did not even look at her. "You will stay here. Lock the door behind me and do not open it for anyone but me." "I will not," she said, stepping in front of him, blocking his path. "I am not a child. Boone, I will not hide in this shack while you go out there to fight my battle." He finally stopped and looked down at her, his eyes blazing with a fierce, protective fire. "This is not your battle. This is my fight now. It has been since the moment they set foot on this land." "They are here because of me," she insisted, her voice rising. "They are the men who left me for dead. Do you think I can just sit here and wait, not knowing if you are alive or dead? I cannot. You taught me to shoot. You taught me to survive. Was that all just a game? Did you mean none of it?" "I meant every bit of it," he growled, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "I taught you so you could protect yourself, not so you could ride into a nest of rattlesnakes with me." He took a step closer, his size and intensity overwhelming. "This is not a discussion. Clara, it is too dangerous. You are staying here. That is the end of it." He saw her as weak. After everything they had been through, after she had worked beside him, fought with him, loved him, he still saw the helpless woman he had pulled from the river. The realization was a bitter, painful blow. All her progress, all her newfound strength, meant nothing to him when it mattered most. Tears of fury and hurt stung her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She held his gaze, her chin lifted in defiance. "I see," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "I am strong enough to mend your fences and warm your bed, but not strong enough to stand beside you when there is real trouble." A look of pain flashed across his face. "That is not what this is. That is exactly what this is," she retorted, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. "You will not do this. You will not shut me out and treat me like a porcelain doll. I will not let you." She turned on her heel and stalked to the other side of the shack, her back rigid with anger. She would not let him see how much his refusal had wounded her. Boone watched her go, his face a mixture of frustration and anguish. He did not know how to make her understand that this was not about her strength. It was about his fear. The thought of her in the line of fire was a cold, paralyzing terror that he could not face. He finished his preparations in a grim silence, the chasm between them once again wide and deep. He left just after dusk. "Bolt the door," was all he said before he melted into the growing darkness. Clara stood in the middle of the shack for a long time, listening to the sound of his horse's hoofbeats fade into the night. The silence he left behind was suffocating. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. The fear she had held at bay for weeks came rushing back, a suffocating tide. But beneath the fear was a hard, cold core of anger. He was wrong to leave her behind. He was wrong to think he could face her demons for her. She would not let him. She would not be a victim waiting for a savior. She was done waiting. Her decision was a spark in the darkness, and it ignited her into action. She moved with a feverish determination, her hands sure and steady. She pulled on the rough trousers and the heavy boots. She checked the rifle Boone had taught her to use, her fingers moving over the familiar wood and steel with a newfound confidence. She filled a waterskin and slung it over her shoulder. She was terrified. A deep, bone-shaking terror threatened to overwhelm her, but her resolve was stronger. She would rather die on her feet facing her fear than live on her knees hiding from it. She unbolted the door and slipped out into the moonless night. The trail Boone had taken was easy enough to follow in the faint starlight. She moved as quietly as she could, her heart hammering against her ribs with every snapped twig, with every rustle of a night creature in the brush. The wilderness, which had started to feel like a home, was once again a menacing, alien place. It took her nearly 2 hours to reach the base of the canyon pass. She could see the faint flicker of a campfire up ahead, nestled in a rocky overhang. That had to be their camp. She slowed her pace, moving from boulder to boulder, her breath held tight in her chest. She was just trying to get closer, to see what was happening, when a hand clamped down on her shoulder from behind, hard and inescapable. She let out a strangled cry and spun around, raising the rifle. "What in God's name do you think you are doing?" Boone's voice was a furious, terrified hiss in the darkness. He had circled back, anticipating her foolishness. "I am finishing this," she hissed back, trying to wrench her shoulder from his grasp. "With or without you." "You are going to get yourself killed," he raged, his voice still a harsh whisper but filled with a terror that was palpable. He grabbed the rifle from her, his strength easily overpowering hers. "And you are going to get yourself killed," she retorted, her own fear and anger boiling over. "Going in there alone against 3 men. I will not let you be that stupid." "This is my life, my choice." "And what about my life?" she cried, the words torn from her. "What about what I want? Why can you not see that I need to do this? I need to face them. You still see me as weak, do not you, after all of this? You still see me as the helpless woman in a torn dress who you have to protect from the world." "Damn it, Clara, this is not about you being weak," he yelled, his voice finally breaking free of its whispered restraint. The sound echoed unnervingly in the quiet canyon. "This is about me. This is about the fact that I buried a wife and a child a lifetime ago. It is about the fact that I watched a woman I thought I loved tear my life apart. I have lost everything I have ever cared about. I will not lose you too." His raw, desperate confession hung in the air between them, a stunning, heartbreaking admission. He was not trying to protect her from the world. He was trying to protect himself from the agony of losing her. But they had no time to absorb the weight of his words. A voice called out from the darkness near the campfire. Well, what have we got here?" They both froze. A figure detached itself from the rocks, a rifle cradled in his arms. It was the man from the stagecoach, the one with the cruel, bearded face. Another man appeared from the other side. They had been arguing in the open, exposed and vulnerable. They had been ambushed. Everything happened in a blur of motion and noise. Boone shoved Clara behind him, drawing his pistol in a single, fluid movement. "Get back," he snarled. A shot rang out from the darkness. Boone cried out, a sharp, guttural sound of pain, and staggered sideways. He clutched at his side, a dark stain spreading rapidly across his shirt. Clara screamed his name. Time seemed to slow down, to stretch into an unbearable, syrupy crawl. She saw the bearded man raising his rifle again, taking aim at Boone, who was struggling to stay on his feet. The world narrowed to that single, terrible image. Fear, cold and absolute, threatened to paralyze her. The old instinct to run, to hide, to survive by fleeing, screamed in her mind, but another instinct, newer and stronger, rose up to meet it. It was the instinct to protect. It was the fierce, primal love she felt for the man who was bleeding in front of her. She did not think. She reacted. She lunged for the rifle Boone had dropped. She lifted it to her shoulder, the movement clumsy but sure, a muscle memory forged through days of painful practice. She found the bearded man in her sights. She saw his surprised, leering face in the moonlight. She remembered Boone's voice in her ear. Breathe out slow. Squeeze. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. A familiar, brutal kick. The explosion was deafening. Through the cloud of gun smoke, she saw the man crumple, a look of shock on his face. He made a strange, hollow sound and fell backward, his rifle clattering on the rocks. The other man, startled, fired a wild shot into the air and then scrambled back into the darkness, disappearing into the rocks. Silence descended upon the canyon, thick and ringing. The only sound was Boone's ragged breathing and the frantic, wild thumping of her own heart. She stood frozen, the heavy rifle still in her hands, shaking uncontrollably. She had just killed a man. The thought was a cold, slick thing in her mind. She did not feel triumph. She did not feel relief. She felt only a cold, sick emptiness and the grim, absolute certainty that she had done what was necessary. A low groan from Boone shattered her paralysis. She dropped the rifle and scrambled to his side. He was slumped against a boulder, his face pale and beaded with sweat in the moonlight. "Boone!" she sobbed, her hands hovering over the dark, wet patch on his side, afraid to touch him. "We have to go," he grunted, his voice strained with pain. "The other one, he will be back, with friends." She had to get him out of there. She had to get him home. A wave of panic threatened to drown her. He was a big man, a dead weight of muscle and bone. How could she possibly move him? But the panic was a luxury she could not afford. She looked at his face, contorted in pain, and a fierce, cold resolve settled over her. She would not let him die here. The wilderness had tried to take her, and he had refused. Now it was trying to take him, and she would be just as stubborn. She looped his arm over her shoulders, taking on his weight. "Lean on me," she commanded, her voice surprisingly steady. "We are going home." The journey back to the shack was a living nightmare. Every step was an agony. Boone, delirious with pain, stumbled and fell several times. Clara, her own muscles screaming in protest, somehow found the strength to haul him back to his feet. She talked to him the entire way, a constant stream of whispers, prayers, and promises. Anything to keep him conscious, to keep him moving. They finally stumbled through the door of the shack as the first pale light of dawn was breaking. He collapsed onto the cot, his breathing shallow, his skin clammy and cold. The front of his shirt was soaked in blood. Clara moved with a desperate, focused energy. She lit a lantern, her hands shaking so badly it took her 3 tries. She tore strips from the cleanest part of her old wedding dress, the last remnant of the woman she had once been. She heated water on the fire. She took Boone's knife, the one he was always sharpening, and held it in the flames until the blade glowed red. She gently cut away his shirt. The wound was a ragged, ugly hole in his side, still oozing blood. He was burning with fever, muttering names she did not recognize. She cleaned the wound as best she could, her stomach churning at the sight and smell of it. There was no doctor for miles. There was only her. She spent the entire night and the next day tending to him. She bathed his feverish body with cool water. She forced sips of broth between his cracked lips. She packed the wound with moss, an old remedy she had heard of once, to stop the bleeding. She sat by his side, holding his hand, whispering to him, telling him stories of her childhood, telling him about the future they would have, begging him not to leave her. She prayed to a God she was not sure she believed in, making desperate bargains for his life. he survived, barely. The fever raged for 2 days, and there were times she thought she had lost him, times when his breathing was so shallow she had to put her ear to his lips to feel it. But on the 3rd day, the fever broke. His breathing deepened, and he fell into a natural, healing sleep. Clara stayed by his side, exhausted but vigilant. She did not sleep in a bed. She curled up on the furs on the floor beside his cot, so she would hear him if he stirred. She was dirty, her clothes stained with his blood, her hair a tangled mess. She had not eaten a proper meal in days, but she did not care. Nothing mattered but the slow, steady rise and fall of his chest. Several days later, she woke from a light, fitful doze on the floor. The sun was streaming through the window, and the room was quiet. She sat up, her body stiff and aching, and looked at the cot. Boone was awake. He was looking at her. His eyes were clear, the fever gone. He took in the sight of her, asleep on the floor, disheveled and exhausted. He saw the dried blood under her fingernails, the dark circles under her eyes. He saw the fierce, weary guardian who had refused to let him go. A slow, gentle smile touched his lips. He reached out a hand toward her. "My wife," he said, his voice a weak, scratchy whisper. But the 2 words were the strongest, most powerful thing she had ever heard. They were not a question. They were a statement, a fact, an acknowledgement of everything she had done, everything she had become. Tears welled in her eyes, tears of exhaustion and overwhelming relief. She crawled over to the cot and took his hand, pressing it to her cheek. They held each other, 2 scarred and trembling survivors, bound together not by a preacher's words, but by blood and fear and a love that had been forged in the harshest of fires. He held her hand, his thumb stroking the bone ring on her finger. "After all this," he whispered, his eyes searching hers, "do you still want to stay?" She looked around the small, rough shack that had become her whole world. She looked at the hard, wounded man who had become her home. She nodded, a fierce, certain love shining in her eyes. "I would die out there without you," she said, and it was the truest thing she had ever said. It was not a confession of weakness. It was a statement of fact. They were 2 halves of a whole, and out here, in this wild and unforgiving land, they could not survive apart. Healing was a slow, stubborn business. Boone's body, though strong, had been grievously wounded, and it clung to its recovery with a miser's grip. The days bled into weeks. Clara's life found a new, grueling rhythm, a relentless cycle of tending, mending, and hard labor. She would wake before dawn to change the dressing on his wound, her touch gentle but firm, her movements practiced and sure. She would feed him broth, spooning it into his mouth as if he were a child, ignoring his weak, frustrated protests. And while he was confined to the cot, a restless prisoner in his own home, the world outside did not wait. The fence they had built, their first true act of partnership, had been damaged again by a flash flood that had roared through the lower pasture while they were fighting for his life. One morning, Boone woke to the rhythmic, percussive sound of an axe splitting wood. He struggled to sit up, his sides screaming in protest, and looked out the open door. Clara was out by the ruined corral, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows, her face set in a mask of fierce concentration. She was splitting new rails from a fallen cottonwood, the axe swinging in a wide, powerful arc that was surprisingly graceful. Her body, once soft and unused to labor, was now lean and corded with muscle. She moved with an economy of motion that spoke of days spent at the same unforgiving task. When she had a pile of fresh rails, she began the back-breaking work of digging new post holes, her whole body straining with the effort. He watched her for hours, a complex and overwhelming mix of emotions churning inside him. Pride, so fierce it was almost painful. Awe at the sheer, indomitable force of her will, and a deep, abiding love that settled into his bones, as real and solid as the ground beneath the shack. This was not the woman he had found by the river. That woman was a ghost, a memory. This woman was a force of nature. She was a survivor who had looked into the abyss and had not flinched. She had taken his broken world into her two hands and was patiently, stubbornly, building it anew. He had thought he was saving her, but now he saw the truth. They were saving each other. When she finally came inside, exhausted and streaked with sweat and dirt, she found him staring at her, his eyes full of an emotion so raw and intense it made her stop in her tracks. "You should be resting," he said, his voice a rough whisper. "The fence will not fix itself," she replied, pouring water from a bucket into a basin to wash. "That was my job," he said, a note of his old, wounded pride in his voice. She turned to face him, her eyes soft but unwavering. "It is our fence, Boone. It is our land. That makes it our job." She came and sat on the edge of the cot, taking his hand in hers. Her hand was no longer soft. It was calloused and strong, a match for his own. "Let me be strong for you now," she whispered. "You have been strong for me long enough." He looked down at their joined hands, at the white, polished circle of the bone ring on her finger, and he simply nodded, his throat too thick with emotion to speak. A month after the shooting, he was finally strong enough to ride. His side was still tender, a constant, pulling reminder of his own mortality, but his strength had returned. There was one last piece of business they had to attend to, one final ghost to lay to rest. "We are going to town," he announced one morning. Clara felt a flicker of the old apprehension, but it was quickly extinguished by a new, steady confidence. She nodded. "Let me get ready." They rode into Verde Creek side by side, their heads held high. The town had not changed. The same judgmental eyes watched them from the boardwalks. The same whispers followed them like flies. But something fundamental had changed within Clara and Boone. They were no longer two separate, wounded outcasts. They were a unit, a fortress of two. The town's contempt could not breach their walls. They walked past the saloon, past the general store, and straight to the small, dusty office of the territorial land agent. The agent, a man with a green eye shade and ink-stained fingers, looked up in surprise as they entered. "Boone," he said, his tone wary. "Did not expect to see you here." "I need to file a deed," Boone said, his voice calm and steady. He placed a pouch of coins on the counter. "For my parcel of land out by the Rio Verde." The agent nodded, pulling out a fresh sheet of paper and dipping his pen in the inkwell. "And the name for the deed?" "Boone," he said. Then he paused and looked at Clara, who stood beside him, her hand resting in the crook of his arm. He placed his other hand over hers, his thumb stroking the bone ring. "And Clara?" The agent's pen stopped scratching. He looked up, his eyebrows raised. "Two names. Boone and Clara who?" Clara had no other name to give. The one she had been born with was a part of a past she had shed like a snake's skin. Boone seemed to understand. "Just Boone," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "And just Clara. The land is in both our names. Equal partners." The agent shrugged, seeing the look in Boone's eyes, and went back to his writing. Clara watched the pen scratch their names into the official record of the territory. Boone and Clara, two names, side by side, bound together by ink and earth and a shared will to survive. It was more real, more binding to her than any marriage certificate. This was a promise of a future, a home, a life built together from the ground up. He was finally, truly accepting that she was not leaving. She was home. As they stepped out of the office and into the harsh sunlight, a familiar, mocking voice cut through the air. "Well, look what the cat dragged in." Twice, Sadie, the saloon girl, was leaning against a post, a smug, knowing look on her painted face. She had obviously been waiting for them. "Making your arrangement official, are we?" she said, her voice loud enough for the whole street to hear. Buying her for the season, Boone. Or did you just decide to put a name to what she really is? Boone tensed, his body going rigid, the old, violent fury flashing in his eyes. He started to take a step toward her, but Clara put a hand on his chest, stopping him. No, she said, her voice quiet but firm. Let me. She turned to face Sadie, her expression not angry but calm, almost pitying. She was no longer the frightened, ashamed girl from their last encounter. She was a different woman entirely. Hello, Sadie, she said, her voice clear and carrying in the quiet street. It is a fine day, is not it? Sadie was taken aback by her calm demeanor. Do not you try to play the grand lady with me, she sneered. I know what you are. Everyone here knows what you are. Do you? Clara asked, a small, sad smile on her lips. You know a girl who was hungry and scared, a girl who did what she had to do to survive, and yes, that girl was me. I am not ashamed of her. She is the reason I am still standing here today. She took a step closer, her gaze unwavering. But what I am now, she continued, her voice ringing with a quiet, powerful dignity, is a woman who has found a home. I am a woman who is loved by a good, strong man, and I am a woman who has learned that her past does not have to be her future. She glanced at the land deed she held clutched in her hand. My name is on that paper, right next to his. This is my land, this is my life. And you, Sadie, have no power over me anymore. She turned away, leaving the saloon girl speechless, her painted mouth hanging open. Clara took Boone's arm, and together, without a backward glance, they walked away. As they were untying their horses, a man in a dusty black coat and a clerical collar approached them. He was older, with kind, tired eyes and a gentle face. Forgive me for intruding, he said, his voice soft. My name is Reverend Miller. I could not help but overhear, and I could not help but see the way you two look at each other. He smiled. The law of the territory and the law of God are two different things. That paper you hold is a fine start, but a life together should be blessed. If you would have me, I would be honored to marry you. Clara and Boone looked at each other, both of them taken by surprise. A formal wedding, a preacher, God's blessing. It was all part of a world they had never belonged to. They had already made their commitment. In the shack, on the riverbank, in blood and in love. They did not need a preacher's words to make it real. They hesitated, the same thought passing between them, and then, in the exact same breath, they both said, yes. The wedding was as simple and as real as the life they were building. The Reverend Miller stood with them on the bank of the Rio Verde, in the very spot where it had all begun. There were no guests, no fancy clothes. The river was their witness, the vast blue sky their cathedral. Clara had woven a small crown of purple wildflowers into her hair, and she held a small bouquet of them in her hands. Boone stood beside her, his hand, calloused and strong, holding hers. She could feel a fine tremor running through it, and it filled her with a fierce, protective tenderness. The preacher's words were a quiet murmur against the sound of the flowing water, familiar phrases of love and honor and commitment that suddenly felt new and profound when he pronounced them man and wife. Boone turned to her, and the look in his eyes was a vow all on its own. He leaned down and kissed her, a gentle, reverent kiss that sealed the promise. After the preacher had wished them well and ridden away, they stood alone by the river's edge as the sun began to set. This was their church. This was their sacred ground. I do not have pretty words. Clara, Boone said, his voice thick with emotion as he turned her to face him. Not like that preacher, but I promise you this. I will stand by you. I will fight for you, and I will love you until the day this river runs dry. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the image of his beloved, rugged face. And I promise you, she whispered back, her voice choked with tears and laughter. "To mend your fences, to fight your demons, and to never, ever let you be alone again." He pulled her into his arms, and his mouth came down on hers, rough and raw and full of all the passion they had held in check during the ceremony. It was a kiss of homecoming, a kiss of forever. She clung to him, laughter breaking through her tears, a pure, joyous sound. She pulled back just enough to look into his eyes, a familiar, teasing glint returning to hers. "I meant what the preacher said, you know," she murmured, her voice a husky invitation. "To love, honor, and obey." She leaned in, her lips brushing his ear. "But I will be good, if you are rough." A low growl of laughter rumbled deep in his chest. It was the sound of a man who had finally found his peace. "Woman," he said, his voice full of wonder and a love as vast as the land around them. "You are going to be the death of me, or the life of you," she whispered back, before he kissed her again. They rode back to their land as the last light of day painted the sky in brilliant strokes of gold and crimson. They were no longer just Boone and Clara. They were a single entity, a new creation, hardened by the unforgiving West but softened and made whole by each other. They were stronger together than they had ever been apart. From a distance, a lone traveler might have seen it, a small, rugged shack in the middle of a vast, wild land. A thin curl of smoke rising from the stone chimney, a beacon of warmth against the coming night. And if that traveler looked close enough, in the golden light pouring from the single window, they might have seen two shadows, tangled together as one, moving in a slow, sweet dance, still healing, still burning, still in love. Thank you for joining us around the campfire. Let us know where in the world you are listening from in the comments to connect with fellow travelers. And be sure to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts on the story in English.